Good evening. So we have people from all over the world, from all time zones, to this webinar on sex and gender issues in the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that all of you are fine and healthy in these turbulent times. So my name is Matthias Burkhalter. I work for MDPI, a scientific publisher organizing scientific events all over the world, and I am an advisor of the Women's Brain Project. Before we start, I would like to tell you that we are organizing another webinar tomorrow on SciForum on how to avoid a new lockdown. And we have a very prominent speaker there, Antoine Flower from the Geneva Global Health Institute. So I will post the registration link in the chat. For questions, please only use the Q&A function to be discussed after the talks. We have also prepared a number of polls which will open in pop-up windows during the whole webinar. After the webinar, you can directly interact with the panelists by raising your hand. You will then be granted to go online and talk directly to the panelists, which will be there for another 30 minutes plus. And now it's a great pleasure for me, and I would like to pass the word and introduce you to Antonella Santuccione Chadha. She is a medical doctor, pathologist, and neuroscientist. She is co-founder and CEO of the Women's Brain Project Pro Bono. She is a medical director for Alzheimer's disease within a pharma company and was elected Woman of the Year in Switzerland from the Women in Business magazine. Antonella, please open the webinar officially.
So once again, a warm welcome to everybody around the planet. Before we move on, I think we go back of one slide, and I'm kindly asking you to share where you are actually. Where are you geographically located? There will be a poll, and if you can please kindly answer. At the meantime, I am telling you that opinions and thoughts that I'll be sharing during this conversation might not necessarily reflect the one of my official employer. Good. So we have people from Switzerland, United Kingdom, United States of America, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria, China. Then, yeah. Good. So majority, it is from Switzerland. Then we have US, we have Italy, we have Austria, and we have majority women, it seems. But it's also very nice to see that we have a male audience. So thank you very much for joining. I think we can close the poll and we can go on. So I am particularly pleased to introduce you to the conversation that we will have tonight. And this is about how sex and gender have been impacting the COVID pandemic around the globe. Please, next. This is the agenda for today, and we will have an opening which will be done by Dr. Ewelina Biskup. She's a member of the executive of the Women's Brain Project, and she's currently in China, where she reached already on the 10th of February. She will discuss with us about the Chinese Day. Then we will have Dr. Teresa Ferretti. She is our Chief Scientific Officer at the Women's Brain Project, and she will describe us about the Italian data and the impact of sex and gender on those. We will move on to Dr. Florencia Iulita. She's also part of the executive committee of the Women's Brain Project, and she will describe the Spanish data. Finally, our president, Dr. Annemarie Schumacher Dimech, she will describe how also gender has an impact on the pandemic. We will then, as we heard, move towards the Q&A session. If you have already questions during the presentation, please crystallize them in the chat box, in the chat window we have. And eventually, we will also open up to a conversation later on. Please, next. Before we go into the core of the data, I would like to give you a flavor of what the Women Brain Project is actually doing. So the Women Brain Project engaged already in a discussion about the understanding of sex and gender differences impacting brain and mental health diseases a while ago. It is an international nonprofit founded in 2016, and we are believing that this is the gateway to precision medicine. We focus on four main axes. One, it is trying to understand the impact of sex and gender in basic science, understanding how biological differences might have an impact on brain and mental health. Nevertheless, we know that this has an impact also in other diseases, as for instance, the pandemic that we are all unfortunately experiencing. Then we focus also on clinical science and how sex and gender differences might impact clinical development, how the learning from such difference should be implemented in a clinical trial design to optimize clinical outcome. We are also focusing on understanding the socio-economic risk factors impacting sex and gender differences in brain and mental health diseases. In fact, we know that health is not just about biology, but also education, social status, geography, ethnicity, everything plays a role. Finally, we also know that an impact of sex and gender differences might be in the way we design and develop novel technology. So we're also studying those, focusing on digital biomarker, artificial intelligence solution, ethics, and as I said, the impact they have in novel technology. Next, please. Who is behind the Women Brain Project? So I'm very proud to introduce you an extraordinary team, brilliant humans who are all moving towards the achievement, as we said, of the understanding of the sex and gender differences to reach finally precision medicine. And we have scientists from various disciplines in doing so. And this includes medical doctors, neuroscientists, psychologists, pharmacists, people specialized in communication, in novel technologies. We have caregivers, we have patients at the centers. We should not forget that each of us, highly likely, one day will be patients as well, relatives of patients, policymakers, stakeholders. Please, next slide. What we do, it is actually generating facts. We do produce scientific evidences as why these differences have an impact on brain and mental health, and more in general in diseases, and they get published in scientific journals, as you can see. But what makes us, I think, a very successful organization is that we have a strong interest also from press, social media, and lay public. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and also on LinkedIn. And actually, the sharing of science, for us, it is at the core. We believe that people need to be empowered by scientific knowledge, which has to be shared with the society as a whole. Next one, please. So we have these core activities, as I said, publication, but we also have our forum, which it is now an yearly event. We are going to have the third edition on the 19th and 20th of September, discussing whether it's going to be a full virtual event or whether we are going to have an hybrid form. And of course, with the evolving of the scenarios, we will be able to tell you more. We organize workshops, which are educational workshops, bringing science, but also bringing knowledge about mental health to the general public, to specialized stakeholders which are working in the field of health, medicine, and drug development. And our final aim, it is to reach out to the whole scientific community and establish a sex and gender precision research institute, which basically will have a virtual connectivity and a global reach out. This is all in light of what we believe should become a sustainable way of doing health development and being highly engaged with the core features of the SDG goals, making healthcare sustainable as an whole. Next slide, please. So we can say that we aim to achieve an impact across the whole healthcare ecosystem. We provide a response to an unmet medical need in scientific research, basically. And as I mentioned already, we are committed to 7 of the 17 SDG goals because we believe that precision medicine will make healthcare system indeed sustainable, moving from shallow medicine, what Eric Topol described as such, towards precision medicine. And this is achievement, as we said, of precision, personalized medicine, and this will certainly allow an improvement of the whole health outcomes, and finally allowing cost saving in the healthcare system. Next slides, please. So now I am coming to the discussion, which is at the core of this appointment tonight. And I am very proud in introducing you Dr. Ewelina Biskup. She is a specialist in internal medicine and public health, and she's also associate professor at the University of Medicine and Science in Shanghai. She's an executive committee member of the Women Brain Project, and actually also on our behalf, she decided to go let's say, to Wuhan in China already on the 10th of February. She wasn't able to reach out the Wuhan zone, but she remained in Shanghai, where she acted as our main source of information. So I leave the conversation to Ewelina, and thank you so much for your attention. Ewelina, can you hear us? We have some problems, it seems, with the connection. Ewelina, can you hear us? She's still on mute, if she could be unmuted. Matthias, we also can't hear you. Otherwise, I think I have to run the whole show on my own, which I hope is not going to be the case. So we need to unmute all the other speakers, Matthias. Can we try to do that? Thank you. So Matthias, it seems your messages are, yeah, now you are the host. Very good, Matthias. Anna, they can talk.
Beautiful, yes, there we go. There we
made it.
Great, great, great. Thank you very much. It worked. Thank you very much, Antonella, for the introduction. Thank you very much for having me here with this amazing group of panelists. And thank you very much, everybody who joined. It's really fantastic to be with such a phenomenal audience. I had a look at the list, and it's amazing to have so many scientists and colleagues and advocates and beyond online. Without further ado, I would like to go over to my first slides showing some data from China. And just to point out, me and the other speakers will just give some key points that we can hopefully elaborate on later on in the questions and answers. So don't be frustrated if we just briefly mention them here. We would like to engage in a discussion later on. So as for China, as you may remember, the very first data came out late February on about 40,000 plus patients. And although, as we know, as the pandemic continued to unfold, we were seeing the variety of inequalities being exposed in other countries. But basically this data already give a first alert and laid the base also for other countries to be more alert to disaggregate their data by at least sex. In China, what we have seen was that although the infection rate for men and women was comparable, at least was pretty much equal, the death rate among males was significantly higher. So about 2/3 of the fatalities were males, and the case fatality rate mirrored it very nicely, being almost the double. However, one have to also say that the severity of the disease in males was higher, and the mortality was specifically higher in older males. And this became also a public health messaging. So this was used for the mitigation, communicated with the society to expose older men being more vulnerable in the population. I would like to mention that we do not have an update of the data ever since, unfortunately. So even Global Health 50/50 is showing still those numbers, although we have, of course, much more fatalities, unfortunately, and cases in China reported later on, even in the biggest publication in JAMA of over 70,000 patients, we do not have stratification by sex. Nevertheless, and I would like to go to the next slide. Nevertheless, these numbers and the debate around them gave us and the lay public and the scientists who are working unparalleled on this some conclusions and hypotheses, and I will just mention them briefly as I said, because they are reflecting also how important it is to discriminate and to combine the debate about sex and gender, the biological aspect and the social aspect of masculinity and femininity. So what we have seen is that men are at a higher risk, and specifically in China, presumably over 90% of all reported smokers are men. So men are more prone to report that they are smoking. Smoking has been laid out as one of the main risk factors in that disease based on the lung damage that is pre-existing. We have seen that also, and all the other factors were looked upon. It was prompted by scientists to look upon other pandemics that we went through and other epidemics, SARS and MERS, especially because of the similarity of the virus. Also, several comorbidities were identified as being risk factor for the disease, and those, among those, especially diabetes and arterial hypertension, are much more prevalent in Chinese males. So there are studies that support those observations, so that might be one of other reasons. And other hypotheses such as immunosenescence, so the aging of the immunological system, the basic difference between the biological immunological system of males and females, by females being stronger and having a more prone mount reaction, and also the protective role of estrogen has been put out there. So, and please, we move to next slide. So the tendency of men to developing more severe outcomes were laid out on that. And I would like to just briefly mention one important aspect that I hope we will talk about later on as well in the Q&A session, is about the healthcare workers. As you may know, in China, almost all healthcare workers have been mobilized and to go to Wuhan. We have had over 42,000 going there, and of course people being there at the front line from the very beginning, and 2/3 of those people were women. And the infection rate among healthcare workers in Wuhan was about 2.7%. So about 2,000 people, and 3,000 were tested positive, although they were asymptomatic. And from the 61 persons, healthcare workers who deceased, who died, 12 were women and 49 men. So there was a very, very big discrepancy seen there. With this, I would like to conclude, and I pass the word to Anna, who will have another round of a poll.
Thank you so much. So now we come to the second polling. So this is about sex and gender differences in the pandemic. This will take rather longer to reflect on, so I'll give you all a moment. And here we have 2 questions.
Good.
Just give people a bit more time to see what's coming. I'm going to share the results now. So here we can see the first question: given that more men than women are dying from the virus, what do you think is the research opportunity for science and society in general? So here we have the basically identifying risks that are gender specific, and then very high scores also for tailoring treatments for men and women. We'll come to that with Mary Teresa's talk. Understanding the biological and gender differences scored quite highly as well. And then we have this followed by disaggregate data for more detailed insights. And then the second question, how do you think the pandemic may increase gender-based inequalities? You can see the results there scoring most highly. We have hindering access to regular healthcare services, increasing violence against women and girls, and then also increasing the already existing burden. And then also here is flagged very highly, increasing the risk for frontline health workers, given that the majority of those are women. So I'll stop sharing that now. And then I'd like to come on to pass on to Marie Teresa. And Marie Teresa is a neuroscientist, a neuroimmunologist, and very much dedicated and focused on Alzheimer research. She's one of the co-founders of the Women's Brain Project, and currently she is also the Chief Scientific Officer of Women's Brain Project. So I pass over to Maria Teresa.
So hi everyone, thank you Anna. Thank you all for being here, and a special thank to Eva really for starting this whole project, kicking it off with me and with the rest of the group, for starting this conversation on sex and gender differences. While we were discussing the Chinese data with Eva, unfortunately the virus spread to Europe and reached Italy, and we had the very first big outbreak in Europe. As you know, over 20,000 people died in Italy because of the virus, so it was a big and tragic situation. But again, out of this tragedy, we saw an opportunity. There is an opportunity for improving science, and that's when we started to look into the Italian data. The Istituto Superiore di Sanità, so the Italian health authorities, immediately started to publish epidemiological data and almost immediately showed stratification by sex and gender. And that allowed us to compare really the results and to further the discussion. So what I would like to show you today is just a couple of key points on the Italian landscape that kind of confirm what Eva has just told us and add additional elements for discussion. So the picture coming out of the Italian cases till now, these are data updated to a few days ago, is, as Eva said, infection rate is very similar, almost 50-50 between men and women. I'm looking here. The deaths are more common amongst men. The gross average is 63% of deaths in men, but actually you will see with the data stratified by age, in some age brackets is much more. And then a special mention to health workers I would like to make. In Italy, we have a huge problem with very high rates of infection amongst health workers. 10% of all cases are people working in the hospitals. In this specific group, we have a majority of women affected. We do not have mortality data official yet, but for sure we have more healthcare workers, women who are affected with the virus. And this is a topic related to gender that Annemarie will develop then later on during the discussion today. So here I'm showing you the deaths cases, again, stratified by gender, but also by age, just again to highlight that the blue bar, so the men cases, basically in all age groups are almost the double than the females. So there is a very clear male bias, which is consistent across age, and it's the only exception is the oldest, 90 plus. And the final bit of information that I wanted to share with you is related to comorbidities, as mentioned by Eva already. The Italian data, the Istituto Superiore di Sanità also published the most common comorbidities associated with deaths. So these were comorbidities that happened to people who ended up dying of COVID. And the data have been shown also stratified by sex. And the picture that we're getting is that men and women, in Italy at least, they seem to have a similar level of comorbidities overall. So we can't really say that men had more comorbidities than women. However, the distribution of the comorbidities is different, especially cardiovascular comorbidities. And I just wanted to highlight, for instance, ischemic heart disease, more common in men, while heart failure and also hypertension more common in women. So this is the type of data that can really help us understanding the reasons for these sex differences, and also instruct and inform strategies for prevention and treatment. So I'm hoping we'll have a chance to discuss this further. And for me, it was very important to understand whether this data would hold on also in other data sets. So that's why we asked Florencia Iulita from our group, who is currently living in Spain, whether she could help us to dig in the Spanish data and see whether the current trend was also supported. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Florencia, who is a research scientist at the Alzheimer Down unit at the Hospital de Sant Pau in Barcelona. She's a member of the Women's Brain Project since the very first days and a member of the executive committee. So thank you, Flor.
Thank you, Mari, for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here tonight, and thank you everybody for joining. It is great to know that we have some old Canadian friends in the audience, so hello all. So the data that we're going to discuss tonight, if we go to the next slide, so these are data that are publicly available at the website of the Spanish Health Ministry. And they are actually updated very regularly, sometimes once or twice per week. And what we have here in this graph is the percentage of confirmed COVID cases separated by age bracket and by sex. So you are seeing men in orange to the left of the graph and women in purple to the right. And the gray part in the middle represents the proportion of men and women in the Spanish population as a reference. So first thing what we can see is, and it was also shown in other countries, that the number of COVID cases is greater in the adult and older adult age brackets, and that very few cases have been seen in children and adolescents. And with respect to men and women, what we can see is that for women, the greater proportion of COVID cases are seen in the brackets between 45 and 60 years, whereas for men, this proportion is greater in the brackets from 60 to 80 years. Now, if we look at the total number of cases or percentages, regardless of age, we see 47.8 men, 52.2% women. And just to point out that this number represents a slightly higher increase of COVID cases in women with respect to the previous data set that were published. And in those data sets, the numbers were more 50-50. But again, as I said, these numbers are being updated regularly. What we are looking at now is actually data from this week. Next slide, please. All right, so here what we have is more preliminary data, I would say, because this represents a smaller percentage of COVID patients for which this more detailed information was available. So in the first table, what we have is a list of the most common COVID symptoms, and these have been separated between men and women. And what you are seeing in each row is the number of cases and the prevalence of that symptom with respect to the number of COVID cases within that group. So what we can highlight is that fever and difficulty breathing were more often seen in men, while sore throat, vomiting, and diarrhea were more often seen in women. And for pneumonia, respiratory complications, and acute kidney failure, these instead were more often seen in men. With respect to comorbidities and risk factors, so having one or more comorbidity or being cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, diabetes, or hypertension, all of these were also seen more often in men than in women. The case of hypertension might be interesting because we may be seeing some differences with respect to the Italian data, so it may be nice to discuss this and see what happens in other countries as well. In terms of exposure, so the last part of the table, so here we are seeing different exposure sources, so being in contact with a COVID positive person, being in contact with a person with acute respiratory illness, being a health professional, or visiting a health center. So all of these exposure sources were also more often seen in women than in men. And if we go to the next slide, what we're going to see is the number of COVID cases separated by disease severity. So in the top left panel, here we have the COVID cases representing the patients who have not been hospitalized. And again, we have men in orange, women in purple. And I think you can appreciate from the graph that there is a greater female predominance compared to males. If we look at the bottom graph to the left, we are looking here at hospitalized patients who have not been to the intensive care unit. And here instead, we are seeing a greater male predominance. And the same is true if we move to the right. So if we are looking at the patients at the intensive care unit or death, these are also more represented by men. And the little table to the right, what it's showing is the data so separated by ICU admissions or death. So what we can see is that for the percentage of men infected, the percentage of ICU admissions was 5.3 compared to 2% in women, and death rates 9.8 in men compared to 5.6 in women. And so with that, I finish and I pass the word to Annemarie, who is the president and co-founder of the Women's Brain Project. Annemarie is a health psychologist and leads a postgraduate program in palliative care at the University of Lucerne. And her main research interests are socioeconomic risk factors of mental health and psychological impact of caregiving. Welcome, Annemarie.
Thank you, Florencia. Thank you to you all for spending your evening with us. I would like to shift the focus slightly from the physical effects of COVID-19 to the psychological impact of this pandemic. And I would just like to give a warning. I will be touching very briefly on some points, and maybe hopefully we'll have the time to talk more about some of these topics during the Q&A. I would like to start with some points from a recent review published in Lancet last February, including studies investigating psychological effects of quarantine in past epidemics. So situations that are comparable to the current one we are going through. And the risk factors that they identified are very relevant to what we are experiencing right now. So there's loss of income or loss of employment, isolation, fear of infection, a history of psychiatric illness or existing ones, inadequate information, and I also added domestic abuse, which is being talked about in relation to self-isolation and quarantine and lack of social interaction. Moving on to the next slide. So when we look at the risk factors from a gender lens, we can then identify differences between the groups and maybe also identify groups that are more at risk. This is a list of psychological impacts related to the risk factors mentioned in the previous slide. I'll just touch upon the first two. So when we talk about depressive and anxiety disorders, what do we know? We know that women are twice as likely to suffer from depression when compared to men, and they also are more likely to suffer from an anxiety disorder. Now, in the current pandemic, what we are going through increases the risk of the general population for such mental health issues and amplifies the existing higher risk of women in this case. So we need to take this into consideration. And the second point I would like to talk about is isolation, which is reported to be a risk factor for cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. Now, isolation is something most of us are going through right now at different levels, in particular the elderly, who are considered to be a risk group regarding COVID. So they are, most of them are abiding by the rules and staying home. And we know that with regard to gender differences, women again are overrepresented when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. And this pattern of more women living with Alzheimer's disease is consistent across cultures and countries. So this is also something that needs to be kept in mind also in the long term. I'm afraid I cannot go into the next point, but I would like to give a special mention to the point about healthcare workers. So if we move to the next slide, our healthcare workforce, they are on the front line, and I would like to start with this interesting statistic from the report by the WHO published last year, which ties in very well with the data presented by Ewelina, Maria Teresa, and Florencia. Namely, 70% of the global workforce is made up of women. So we have more women in the global workforce, more women working in the front line. And apart from the increased risk of infection due to the exposure related to their work, healthcare workers are also exposed to many or all of the risks related to the psychological impact of this pandemic. So we have the mental and emotional stress. Our healthcare workforce, they are experiencing traumatic situations, ethical dilemmas, which can be traumatic in themselves, related to the intense work conditions or to lack of adequate resources. And some of our healthcare workers, depending on their location, are also staying in separate accommodation from their family, which is an increased stress. So being away from your family and maybe having issues of childcare, depending on what support is being provided. So all this poses an increased stress and potential increased risk of mental health consequences in the long term for our healthcare workforce. So we need to be aware of that. We already have some guidelines and recommendations being published in this regard to help work on prevention of long-term mental health issues in the healthcare workforce. Maybe we'll have more time to talk about this in the Q&A. And with this very, very brief overview, I would like to move on to the next poll, which Anna will be presenting.
Thank you so much, Annemarie. So I now move on to the third poll, which is more about your personal experience regarding COVID-19. So I'm going to launch that now, and we have several questions there. So again, I'll give all of you as participants a few moments to answer these questions, because it would be great to get your insights here. So I'll just give you a moment. Okay. So now I'm going to share the results. So firstly, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected you? So we have there a number of you, very small number, have actually had have had the disease yourselves. Quite a significant number of you know someone who has had the virus. Significant number again, fear of job loss, that's very understandable. Anxiety levels have risen, feeling lonely and missing family members and so on. And then we'll look at that in the chat as well. Did you know before this pandemic that there are biological gender differences in how humans react to diseases? Yes, significantly. So you very much are aware of that as an audience. And then here, do you know where you can find information or guidance to understand sex and gender differences? Actually, a lot of you are saying no there, so we need to do better there. So we can address that in the Q&A. And which of the following disease areas would you like to have a further conversation on? So very high in terms of Alzheimer's, dementia, and also depression and anxiety disorders, followed by a few others, but certainly that's very, very interesting insights. Thank you so much. And then on that note, I pass over to Antonella, who will introduce the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. Thank you all for the very nice presentation. We heard about striking differences, I have to say, about mortality related to COVID in this pandemic. And I will be very curious myself to start with the first question to Maria Teresa. Based on your personal opinion, but also on what we have been learning thanks to the scientific publication available already, which are quite a lot, which could be the scientific reasons behind such difference? And I think that this is reflected also with several questions which came across from the audience. Our audience is asking why there are such differences and which could be the scientific reason behind it.
Yeah, so this is really the $1 million question. And the short answer is that nobody knows. We really have no certainty about it, but for sure we have some hypotheses. So I'm happy to share some of the more like basic science hypotheses that I think are interesting to discuss. And then I would also like to mention some additional factors more related to gender and clinical development that we can further discuss together. So in terms of basic science, there are really mostly two hypotheses currently running. One is related to the receptor that the virus uses to enter the cells. This receptor is called ACE2, AC2, and it's the same receptor that was used by MERS and SARS, two other coronaviruses, which also had a male bias. So there is a very strong indication that something biological is happening there. This receptor, the gene for this receptor is expressed on the X chromosome, so there might be differences simply because of that. And in addition, there has been evidence that the expression and the activity of the receptor in different tissues in the body can differ between men and women and are under the control to respond to sexual hormones such as estrogen. So one possible reason for these differences might simply be really the way the virus accesses the cells and attacks them. There is, however, another possibility, which is also extremely likely in my opinion, and Eva has already mentioned it, is related to the functioning of the immune system. Because we do know that the immune system is very different between men and women. And this is what we know is that adult women tend to have a stronger immune response. And that's also, unfortunately, the reason why women tend to suffer more of autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis and lupus. However, this changes with age, and there is evidence to indicate that actually in elderly men or more aged men, there is a stronger pro-inflammatory response than in women. So if you heard about the cytokine storm, which is the one that in the end produces the damage in the lungs, This hypothesis goes that actually the cytokine storm would be much stronger in men, so a completely dysregulated immune response in men, which might explain why they end up with higher mortality. But of course, all these hypotheses need to be tested, so this is also a call for action. We have to analyze the samples, the markers of inflammation, and then we can actually say whether this holds true or not. And beyond these more scientific basic biology reasons, I think there might be other factors in play. One is gender related. So smoking was mentioned, and maybe Annemarie could comment a bit more on that. But in the end, I think also the issue of the comorbidities that the patients present that are different between men and women. And so I would actually pass to any other panelists with more of a clinical background. Maybe Eva wants to comment on this, on how the different comorbidities to begin with might have an impact on the higher mortality for
Yes, and if I may comment first, we just got the specific question from Professor Boada. So please, Ewelina, if you can provide an answer.
She's muted.
Here we are.
We don't want you to talk, Ewelina.
She's fine.
No, I'm on. Great, thank you so much. And yes, very, very happy to also point up on the comorbidities. So I guess just like every other aspect, also this is very multifaceted, because we have different distribution of comorbidities in men and women per se, and then we also see that this distribution is varying among different countries. So what I have shown, for example, which is true for China, is not necessarily the same in Europe, where we I will give a practical example. So cardiac comorbidities will play one of the biggest roles besides the lung comorbidities in this aspect of COVID, simply because of the ACE receptor and perhaps even other receptors that we are and many other people are working on. And while we have more acute diseases in males, like the heart attack, the ischemic events, we have more chronic tissue damage, meaning heart failure or chronic heart failure in women. And then I would like to also point out another thing which is important. The comorbidities are definitely a risk factor for the severity of the disease and potentially also mortality. However, we also have to bear in mind that we still don't know what will be the long-term effects of the virus. So while women have definitely a biologically stronger immune system and mount the response immediately against the virus and other pathogens, they also sometimes, let's say, overdo. So it's a blessing and not a blessing sometimes to have this strong immune system, because the overreaction can cause potentially permanent tissue damage in the long run. So I hope that with this I could address some of the...
Ewelina, we have one question from Emily Wither, and she's asking if we have an explanation as why it seems to be a higher prevalence of gastrointestinal symptoms of COVID in women, and whether this is known to be also for other viral infections such as flu, etc.
Mm-hmm. So the question why they are more prevalent in women, I believe we do not really have an answer for that. However, it is known not only for other infections, but also even for other basic and very well-known diseases. For example, heart attacks. Very often women present with slight back pain or gastrointestinal symptoms instead of the typical pain in the chest and so on. So the unspecific representation of symptoms in women does not surprise me, and I would have expected that. And especially women express very atypical symptoms, not the ones that we learn from the books. So that's why we have to always have the debate about sex and gender, because the symptoms are not different. Are not the same. This is why the diagnosis might be delayed in women or in men.
Just to add something to the discussion, could it be also that perhaps it's a matter of reporting? Is it possible that men maybe, underestimate these symptoms and just do not report them? And when they are asked, they just say, oh, I had fever and difficulty breathing. Is it possible that it's also an issue of reporting?
Definitely, there could be a bias on the social behavior, and we know that males tend to underreport, which is also culturally very different. So I'm not surprised that, for example, we have reporting on that in China a lot, where men are reporting having also other symptoms than only the specific lung problems, pulmonary problems in that case.
We touched here a little bit on the impact that gender might have on diagnosing, reporting, symptoms description. Now we have a question related to this for Annemarie, and this is from Valerie Franek. She's asking whether those differences might be also due to personal hygiene and health recommendation, which might be followed differently between men and women. Any comment, Annemarie?
Yes and no. It's difficult to say because personal hygiene also differs across cultures and regions. So it's very difficult to make a general statement about this. I think perhaps something related to a social factor related to reporting, maybe stigma. People may be afraid of losing their jobs, perhaps, if they have symptoms of a cold and they think, oh, maybe I'll wait this out and see, maybe it's just a normal cold. There is also in some cultures, we've heard of cases where people were attacked, so to speak, to find a better word, because they left quarantine and they were suspected to have the coronavirus. So there's this element of stigma and maybe fear of being associated with being a person infected with COVID. So this could lead to people not reporting. But with personal hygiene, it's very difficult to make a general statement.
I see.
I wouldn't want to do that with having any data at hand to look at.
Thank you, Annemarie, a difficult one. Now, I will say the following. We are reaching the end of our webinar, but my suggestion is as such. For those who have to leave, given also the time, I would just like to disclose the last information for you all and share with you my biggest thank you for participating. We would like to kindly invite you, first of all, to the next series of such webinars that we are kicking off for the future. And so you're highly invited to participate for next conversation, which of course will cover different topics. And if you could reach out to us and ask for specific scientific subjects that you would like to be discussed with the Women Brain Project, please do not hesitate to do so. So propose your preferred topic related possibly to sex and gender difference in any field, and we'll try to keep it up as an argument for discussion. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, we are going to have our third International Forum on Women's Brain and Mental Health as the gateway to precision medicine. This will be 19th and 20th of September. As I already announced, it's not clear if we are going to have it an hybrid solution or we're going to have a full virtual platform. In any case, the forum will be. We are shaping now the agenda and finalize the last speaker. So you're highly invited to attend, book your agenda. We rely on your contribution and your lively discussion. And now for the next minutes, and for those who want to stay, we can open up to a conversation and maybe we can take some live questions. What about that, Matthias? Can you help us with that?
Yeah, so I guess...
We have wonderful questions and I would love to people to ask themselves because they're very relevant and valuable.
So we've Merce Boada raised his hand, and then so I will give him, I brought him now this. So he is online now. Can you hear us?
Hello, may I? But I don't know if you can see me or you can hear me.
Yes,
we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Good night. Hello. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be here. Well, I was only launch one question maybe for the researchers. And then what important thing is we are learning about the COVID process and the COVID disease is the change of the plasma in order that the plasma convalescence on the plasma, the patients that could be recovered is starting a new clinical trials in order to use like infusions on to get amounts of immunoglobulins for treated these kinds of patients. But my question from Maria Teresa, if it's possible, to understand a little more the difference from immunology difference from gender, if we can analyze the reactions in the plasma convalescence from women and men. That is a beautiful research, to understand a little more how is happening the immune systems in the people who suffer and be the survivors of the COVID and to understand how is the difference from the gender in this type of plasma. That is my question, that some of you are interested to analyze and to be start this kind of new research, because it's
Thank you so much, Mercedes. Thank you. Maria Teresa, you want to comment?
She's muted.
It's muted.
Someone unmute Maria Teresa.
Otherwise, I can also just comment.
Thank you. This is a beautiful question, and it's really a dream. This would be my dream research project in this situation. So, Mercedes, if you can help, happy to do.
Yes, of course, I can help.
No, what I just wanted to say, there has been a beautiful paper published on, I think it was an Australian lady who had the virus, and then the scientists took blood at selected intervals after she had the virus, and they could fully describe the evolution of the immune response with the development of antibodies and all that. So ideally, I mean, there are so many things that could be looked at in terms of timing of the response and then the final quality, let's say, of the response in terms of immune population, antibody titers and all that. And I'm sure there are differences between men and women. In general, women mount a stronger immune response. I would expect more antibodies, but who knows what we're going to find. One point that I wanted to bring to the table for discussion, so I'm asking you a question now, because as far as I know, at least in Italy, there are protocols that actually limit the donors that can give plasma in these situations. They have to be males. So they are not using plasma for women because there is a high risk of an inflammatory response in the lungs.
Yes, in the lungs.
But then you might be missing maybe the plasma for women is the most efficient one. So I think this is a very interesting question to ask and to clarify. So I don't know if somebody has comments on this.
We need to talk about this one because it's possible to understand what is happening with the plasma previous to be infected for the COVID. If we have some bank from these biological samples and to analyze in these people the difference when they suffer and to be infectious by the COVID. But I believe that could be offered a good opportunity to understand more about how it's the storming of cytokines different from the men's and women in this kind of the plasma, and even though the relationship with factors who influence so much in the vascular.
Can't hear anymore.
Yes. Because one of the...
Professor Wada, we can't hear you, unfortunately. I think we are taking this suggestion very dear to our heart. And I also want to add that I know that there are already research projects trying to study also the genomic signature of patients and also understand the HLA system, how might influence immune response, etc., etc. So I think that, again, this is... I think I was off. Can you hear me?
Now, yes.
So sorry. What I wanted to say is that it is an opportunity, once again, we heard it, of bringing precision measures to study this type of pandemics. And I think that this is the beauty in a huge tragedy that humanity is unfortunately experiencing. We can bring precise solutions to study, to treat this disease, to diagnose the disease, and also to follow up and monitor the evolving of this condition. But is there any other question from the audience? We will be delighted to hear more. Many also of those who wrote a question and we didn't manage to answer. Otherwise, I'll pick up some. Any question from the audience? Well, there is another question, which is a very important one, I think. And we touched briefly about it already. It's about women being at the core of the healthcare system and being the main working force. How are governments and policymakers taking care of the issue, considering that they are often mothers and that they're anyhow managers of their family? So maybe, Ewelina, you want to comment if you know anything that China might have put in place, and if we have any other suggestion from the speakers on the European soil territory, or even if the audience has some specific suggestion on what their own governments are specifically doing to help women when they do have a family and they have to still work in a hospital.
Yes, it is indeed a very important issue. Here in China, it's socioculturally very well established that the grandparents are helping with the childcare. And also in this specific situation, the pandemics, we have to understand that China was very different from many other countries. So the healthcare workers, when they were at the front line, they were not with their families. So they were leaving either to another city, to the epicenter, to Wuhan, or they were in the same city, but in designated COVID hospitals, which were not in the city center, usually a little bit outside, and accommodation was provided for those healthcare workers. So it was known upfront that they will have to separate from their families, and people who decided to go work at the front line, and I underline this, who decided to go work at the front line, they had precautions taken, and they had the opportunity in the family to have the childcare secured by grandparents or the rest of the family, and so on. And yes, and those who did not have the opportunity were not prompted to go and to work at the front line. So I think that was a very, very strong message from my colleagues, that they did not ever have the pressure. So whenever there was a situation that children were involved, or the person was a caregiver for any other, so also parents and so on. So if there was a caregiver situation, there was no prompting, and it was encouraged to stay. And they say fighting outside the front line is also fighting. This was the motto that was being spread here. So I really liked the way this was handled and promoted.
Which goes a little bit into the direction of what the Leopoldina Academy in Germany said. Basically, you have to educate each of us to understand that we all are fighting in our own way against the spreading and the disease itself, and encouraging individual to be the change maker or the one who carries the main responsibility wherever you are, whether you are in a hospital or at home or walking around along the street. That said, there was a question from Nikolaus.
Oh, I'm sorry, we have Annemarie Rau online now.
Please.
Hello, can you hear me? Annemarie? Hello?
Maybe Annemarie, you are muted. Can you try to unmute yourself?
No, she's not muted. Okay, so let's do another question.
We have a question from Nikolaus, and Nikolaus is asking what are we going to do in very simple terms to fix this problem? Maria Teresa, what do we need to do? Basically, based on the learning of the COVID, which brought to the attention of the whole planet the importance of sex and gender difference in diseases, what shall we do to improve medicine? What is VBP aiming to?
Yeah, that's a big responsibility to answer this question. But our answer is, first of all, science. We need the data. We need to analyze the data to produce the evidence and to really study in detail. So all these sex and gender differences, from biomarkers to symptoms to response to treatment. So we need to stratify all the data that will come out. Actually, current clinical trials, I'm not sure how much they are paying attention to differences between men and women, but I would imagine that those will be very important. So we need to take this information as accurate as possible and use it in all the strategies that we will be implementing. Now it's for COVID, the next time will be another disease, but the principles are always the same. So having guidelines and clear instructions for precise diagnosis, precise prevention, identifying specific risk factors for men and women, precise treatment, and the follow-up eventually. So this is a general learning that we are having here, and we are making it right now as we go. So we have the possibility to change the situation right now. So this is also why we are having the webinars, and we are trying to create awareness on all these aspects. And the hope is really to promote change in the way science is done and eventually impact policy. And maybe Annemarie can comment on the policy aspect, or Anna, what would need to be done.
Well, just briefly with regard to the policy aspect, there are, when it comes to socioeconomic factors, women tend to be a bit on the disadvantaged side when it comes to income, education, although the younger generations are catching up, so the disparity in education is not as clear cut as it used to be in a couple of generations ago. But what is also interesting in the World Health Organization's report just published last year, it's actually, the title is the explanation in itself, delivered by women, led by men. So although women make up 70% of the global workforce, only 25% of women are in senior positions in the health workforce. And who decides, who initiates ideas and issues for policies? People in decision-making roles. And I think we need to find ways to make all groups' voices heard, so not just women, but the various groups. And in this way, we can cater for the different needs and look at the specific risks, not just in the socioeconomic aspect, but also in the biological, sex-specific risks mentioned by my colleagues. And this needs to be done at various levels, both at a policy level, at a decision-making level, but also on a scientific level.
Thank you so much. We have a very interesting question from Cora Siebert, actually. She's asking whether we know of the existence of number of asymptomatic patients or recovered patients which will be disaggregated by sex. I am not aware of those, but I think this is a question to absolutely inquire to the health authorities reporting such data. And so thank you so much for raising the issue. I think we can learn really a lot, and I encourage all the scientists to engage actively with health authorities reporting data, such as that they will disclose as much as possible, and they would be willing to share the data sets to better understand differences. Any other
maybe an issue of testing, right? Because at least, for instance, here in Spain, the numbers that I shared, when we say confirmed COVID cases, these are very advanced cases with the full-blown noticeable symptoms, right? So we also have the issue of testing there.
Absolutely. And another very interesting question, actually, which is from Niels Arnaudse. I don't know if I pronounced the name correctly. It is whether we had such difference in SARS and MERS. Teresa, you may want to comment on this?
There was a similar trend. It's not as strong as with COVID, but also in SARS and MERS, there was higher mortality amongst men than women. This has been shown, yes.
Yeah. Any other open question from the audience or comment, suggestion, how we should improve?
There is one, yes, 1 second. I have to take back the host. Okay, that's done.
84
So it's
people
Jerry
online.
Bellinger. Can you hear us?
Oh, Sherry.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear us?
Jerry, are you still there?
Wait. Yeah. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Sherry?
I'm
Hi.
trying. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Sherry.
Hi.
So nice to be here, and thank you for doing this webinar. I just wanted to make a comment. Earlier, there was a question about how this affects women being caregivers, and the majority of women are obviously the ones who are doing a lot of these things, and it can be overwhelming. And how is there, or is there anything in place to help them? And I just wanted to make a comment because here in the United States, there's been this movement where especially young people are using technology. And so I wanted to just bring it to everyone's attention that there is an app called Juggle. And a lot of nurses have been using this, and nurses and doctors and other healthcare professionals to help them with their childcare, little errands, things at home. And so it's been kind of a fascinating study in psychology and in human nature, really, because people have been turning to technology and different apps like Juggle in order to help facilitate like this unprecedented time where women are needing more help and they don't know what to do. And that's been something that's been really happening over here. And it seems to me like it's been really helping a lot of people. So I just wanted to comment and just share that with everyone, just in case, you know, someone else needs to use that or can share that with other people if they're also in need of help. So technology, different apps like Juggle, and other things like that. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, this is definitely an opportunity for a digital transformation of health in all sense. You know, we are learning about telemedicine. We are learning about monitoring patients from remote, diagnostic tools which are based on artificial intelligence to recognize symptoms immediately or to interpret results from CT scans. So I think, it's, as we said, out of a tragedy, we should turn into an opportunity and improve the way we do health.
Yes.
So with this comment, I think we might close
Antonella, we have a final poll. Shall we do it?
Oh yeah, let's do the final poll and then we might say goodbye and good night. And
Okay.
certainly, thank you for staying with us for so long. So yeah, we said this is the first series of webinars, and thus we would like to know your opinion for future topics. Maybe you want to
Okay. So I'm launching our final poll, which is the future of webinars. So it would be great to know your views on topics for webinars that are specifically related to COVID-19, building on this first webinar. And then also the second question in terms of future webinars in general, what topics you would be interested in. That would be fantastic to get your views on those. So I'll give you a moment to reflect and answer those two questions.
There are some suggestions coming through the chat as well. Muscular dystrophies, differences in dementia.
Yeah.
I'm going to share the results now. So for the first question in terms of COVID-19 specific webinars, so the results have come in. So biological determinants of sex differences has scored very highly. Then we also have caregivers has come out there. And then also socioeconomic factors related to the pandemic, how this is impacting in terms of sexual and reproductive health. And then also here, some interest in the policy impact of the pandemic. in terms of general topics moving forward for webinars, scoring extremely highly sex and gender differences in brain and mental health. And then we have results of the others, just to highlight some scoring particularly highly: introduction to gender medicine and precision medicine and mental health, and then also health communication in sex and gender differences. I believe that should be there. So we'll very much take on board all your feedback and we'll discuss that, and then moving forward this will be food for thought for future webinars. So thank you so much for your input.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So once again, thank you. Good night, everybody, and maybe a round of goodbye for the speakers.
Okay.
Very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matthias,
thank
for
you very
organizing
much.
this. Very precious.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Okay,
Good
thank
night.
you very much. So,
Keep
bye-bye.
safe, everyone.
Good
Bye.
night.